General Viktor Petrov stepped out of his black diplomatic car onto the cobblestones of Windsor Castle. The Russian military attaché had served in many countries, but this was his first official visit to Britain. His chest was covered with medals from various campaigns, and his uniform was pressed to perfection. At 62 years old, Petrov had commanded respect wherever he went, and he expected nothing less here. The autumn morning was crisp, and a light mist hung over the ancient castle grounds. Petrov had been invited to attend a ceremonial event as part of a diplomatic exchange program. Despite the current tensions between Russia and Britain, these formal protocols still continued. His translator, a nervous young man named Boris, walked beside him carrying a leather briefcase. "Remember, General," Boris whispered in Russian, "the British are very particular about their ceremonies. We must follow their lead." Petrov waved him off dismissively. "I have attended ceremonies in 43 countries, Boris. I know how these things work." As they approached the main courtyard, Petrov could see the famous Queen's Guard already in position. 2 guards stood perfectly still at their posts, wearing their distinctive red tunics and tall black bearskin hats. Their rifles were held at precisely the same angle, and their faces showed no emotion whatsoever. The sight fascinated Petrov. He had heard stories about these guards and their legendary discipline. They were said to stand motionless for hours, never reacting to tourists or distractions. Some people tried everything to make them move or smile, but they remained like statues. "Impressive," Petrov muttered to Boris. "But I have trained soldiers who could match this easily." A small group of British officials was waiting nearby to escort them to the ceremony. Among them was Colonel James Harrison, a tall man with a gray mustache who served as the liaison for foreign military visitors. Harrison approached with a polite smile. "General Petrov, welcome to Windsor Castle. I trust your journey was comfortable." "Quite satisfactory, Colonel," Petrov replied in accented English. "Your guards are very disciplined." "Indeed they are, sir. The Queen's Guard maintains the highest standards of military bearing. They are selected from our finest regiments." Petrov studied the guards more closely. Something about their absolute stillness irritated him. In his military career, he had always believed that soldiers should acknowledge superior officers, regardless of nationality. It was a matter of respect and military courtesy. "Tell me, Colonel," Petrov said, "do your guards not salute visiting generals?" Harrison's smile became slightly strained. "The Queen's Guard follows very specific protocols, sir. They salute members of the royal family and their designated representatives. For ceremonial duties, they maintain their positions unless specifically ordered by their commanding officer." This explanation did not satisfy Petrov. He had been saluted by soldiers in Moscow, Beijing, Damascus, and countless other cities. The idea that these British guards would simply ignore him seemed like a personal slight. "But surely," Petrov pressed, "they recognize military rank? I am a general in the Russian armed forces." "Of course, sir, and we have great respect for your position. However, the guards have their orders. They are not permitted to break ceremonial protocol." Petrov's jaw tightened. He looked at the 2 guards again, noting how they stared straight ahead without even acknowledging his presence. In Russia, such behavior toward a senior officer would be unthinkable. Boris tugged gently on Petrov's sleeve. "General, perhaps we should proceed to the ceremony." But Petrov was not ready to move on. His pride had been wounded, and he could feel his temper rising. Throughout his career, he had commanded instant obedience from soldiers. These British guards, with their fancy uniforms and tourist attraction status, seemed to be mocking him. "Colonel Harrison," Petrov said firmly, "I request that your guards acknowledge my presence with a proper salute. It is a matter of military courtesy." Harrison shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I'm afraid that's not possible under current protocols. The guards are on ceremonial duty and cannot..." "Cannot?" Petrov's voice rose slightly. "Are you telling me that British soldiers cannot show respect to a visiting general?" Several tourists nearby had started to notice the conversation. They began gathering at a respectful distance, sensing that something unusual was happening. The scene was becoming more public than anyone wanted. Colonel Harrison glanced around nervously. The last thing he needed was an international incident over ceremonial protocol. "General Petrov, perhaps we could discuss this with the duty officer. There may be some accommodation we can make." But Petrov's patience had run out. Years of commanding troops had taught him that sometimes decisive action was necessary. If these British guards wanted to play games with protocol, he would show them what real authority looked like. "Step aside, Colonel," Petrov said, pushing past Harrison toward the nearest guard. The guard in question was Lance Corporal William Mills, a 24-year-old from Yorkshire. Mills had been with the Queen's Guard for 2 years and had never broken protocol during ceremonial duties. He had stood motionless through thunderstorms, heat waves, and countless attempts by tourists to get his attention. Petrov stopped directly in front of Mills, close enough that the guard would have to acknowledge his presence. The Russian general's face was now red with frustration, and his breathing was heavy. "Soldier," Petrov barked in his command voice, "I am General Viktor Petrov of the Russian Armed Forces. You will salute me immediately." Mills continued to stare straight ahead, his expression unchanged. He had been trained for exactly this type of situation. No matter what anyone said or did, he was to maintain his position until relieved by proper authority. The crowd of tourists was growing larger. Several people had started taking pictures and videos with their phones. What had begun as a routine diplomatic visit was turning into a public spectacle. "Boris," Petrov snapped in Russian, "this is intolerable. These British think they can humiliate a Russian general." Boris was sweating despite the cool morning air. "Sir, perhaps we should—" "No," Petrov cut him off. He turned back to Mills, his face now inches from the guards. "I am giving you a direct order, soldier. Salute me now." Colonel Harrison had gone pale. He could see the situation spiraling out of control, but he was caught between diplomatic protocol and military regulations. Any intervention he made could make things worse. The second guard, Corporal David Thompson, remained at his post, but was acutely aware of what was happening to his partner. Both guards had been briefed on handling difficult situations, but nothing had prepared them for a foreign general demanding salutes in front of tourists. Petrov's frustration reached a boiling point. In his mind, this was no longer about ceremony or protocol. It had become a test of his authority and dignity as a senior military officer. The presence of the crowd made the situation even more humiliating. "Very well," Petrov said through gritted teeth. "If you will not show proper respect voluntarily, I will ensure that you do." What happened next would be talked about for years to come, recorded on dozens of phones, and eventually viewed by millions of people around the world. General Viktor Petrov, in his immaculate uniform covered with medals, reached up toward Lance Corporal Mills with the clear intention of forcing some kind of acknowledgement. But Petrov had severely underestimated both the training of the Queen's Guard and the consequences of his actions. As his hand moved toward the guard, he was about to learn a lesson that would haunt the rest of his military career. The crowd held its breath, cameras rolled, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed 10 o'clock. The peaceful morning at Windsor Castle was about to become anything but peaceful. Mills remained perfectly still, but his muscles tensed imperceptibly. He had been trained for this moment, though he had hoped it would never come. The protocols were clear, and now he would have to follow them, regardless of the diplomatic consequences. General Petrov's fingers were mere inches from the guard's uniform when everything changed forever. The moment General Petrov's hand made contact with Lance Corporal Mills's uniform, everything changed. Mills reacted with lightning speed and precision that came from months of intensive training. His rifle moved from the ceremonial position to a defensive stance, the bayonet now pointing directly at Petrov's chest. "Halt!" Mills shouted in a voice that echoed across the courtyard. "Do not touch the guard!" Petrov stumbled backward, his face going from red to white in an instant. He had never expected such a swift and aggressive response. The crowd of tourists gasped, and several people screamed. Phones were recording everything from multiple angles. Within seconds, Corporal Thompson also shifted to a defensive position, creating a protective barrier around the ceremonial post. The two guards now stood ready to defend themselves and their posts against any perceived threat. "What is the meaning of this?" Petrov sputtered, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried just moments before. Colonel Harrison rushed forward, his face pale with panic. This was exactly the kind of international incident that could destroy careers and strain diplomatic relations. "Stand down! Stand down!" he called to the guards, but they maintained their defensive positions until their sergeant arrived. Sergeant Major Paul Davies came running from the guardhouse, having heard the commotion. He was a veteran with 25 years of service who had seen everything from drunken tourists to actual security threats. His experienced eyes quickly assessed the situation. "What's the situation, Mills?" he barked. "Sergeant Major, foreign individual attempted to make physical contact with guard on ceremonial duty, sir," Mills replied, still maintaining his defensive stance. Davies looked at Petrov, taking in the Russian uniform and medals, then at Colonel Harrison, who was frantically gesturing for calm. The sergeant major had dealt with difficult VIPs before, but never quite like this. "Sir," Davies addressed Petrov firmly but politely, "I'm going to need you to step back from the guards and keep your hands visible." Petrov's translator Boris was nearly hyperventilating. This was far beyond anything he had been prepared for. He began rapidly translating between English and Russian, trying to de-escalate the situation. "The general did not mean any harm," Boris said desperately. "He was simply requesting military courtesy. This is all a misunderstanding." By now, a crowd of more than 50 tourists had gathered. The incident was being broadcast live on social media, with multiple videos showing different angles of the confrontation. Comments were already flooding in from around the world. Security personnel began arriving from various parts of the castle. The situation had triggered multiple alert protocols, and no one was quite sure whether this was a diplomatic incident, a security breach, or both. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins from the Royal Protection Unit was among the first security officials to reach the scene. She had been monitoring the visit of the Russian general, but this was not the kind of problem she had anticipated. "Colonel Harrison," she said quietly, "I need to understand exactly what happened here." Harrison was sweating, despite the cool morning air. The general requested that the guards salute him. When they maintained protocol, he became insistent. Then he attempted to physically interact with Lance Corporal Mills. Inspector Collins turned to Petrov, who was still standing several feet away from the guards, looking increasingly uncomfortable as more officials arrived. "General Petrov," she said in a calm but authoritative voice, "I'm going to need you to come with me for a brief discussion about this incident." Petrov's pride was battling with his growing realization that he had made a serious mistake. "I am a diplomatic visitor," he said stiffly. "I have immunity." "Yes, sir, and we respect that. However, we still need to understand what happened here and ensure everyone's safety." Meanwhile, the guards remained in their defensive positions. According to their training, they would maintain this stance until given an all-clear by their commanding officer. Sergeant Major Davies was waiting for confirmation from higher up the chain of command about how to proceed. The crowd continued to grow, and castle security began cordoning off the area. What should have been a routine diplomatic visit was turning into a major security incident with international implications. Boris was on his phone, frantically calling the Russian embassy. The conversation was heated. with Boris explaining the situation in rapid Russian while receiving what sounded like very stern instructions from the other end. "General," Boris said after ending the call, "the ambassador wants to speak with you immediately. He says this is extremely serious." For the first time since the incident began, Petrov seemed to fully grasp the magnitude of what had happened. His moment of anger had been recorded by dozens of witnesses and was already spreading across the internet. Colonel Harrison was also on his phone speaking with officials at the Ministry of Defense. The conversation was brief but intense, and his expression grew more grave with each passing minute. "Inspector Collins," Harrison said after ending his call, "I've been instructed to escort General Petrov to a private meeting room where we can discuss this matter away from the public eye." The detective inspector nodded. "That's probably best for everyone involved." As they prepared to move Petrov away from the scene, Sergeant Major Davies finally received word from his commanding officer. The guards could stand down from their defensive positions, but should remain at their posts to maintain the ceremonial protocol. Mills and Thompson slowly returned their rifles to the ceremonial position, but both remained visibly tense. They had done exactly what they were trained to do, but the incident would likely be investigated thoroughly. The crowd of tourists was reluctantly dispersing as security personnel asked them to move along. Many were still recording and taking pictures, and several were already posting their footage online with captions like "Russian General Attacks Queen's Guard" and "International Incident at Windsor Castle." As Petrov was escorted away from the scene, he could hear the whispers and comments from the remaining tourists. His face burned with embarrassment as he realized that his moment of anger had been witnessed and recorded by potentially hundreds of people. "This is not how I intended this to go," he muttered to Boris in Russian. Boris, still shaken by the incident, replied quietly, "Sir, I think we may have a very serious problem." The understatement of the day was about to become clear as they learned just how quickly the modern world could turn a single moment of poor judgment into a global news story. Social media was already buzzing with hashtags and commentary, and news organizations were beginning to pick up the story. In the guardhouse, Sergeant Major Davies was filling out an incident report that would eventually reach the highest levels of the British military and government. Lance Corporal Mills and Corporal Thompson were also writing their accounts of what had transpired. "You did the right thing," Davies told Mills. "The protocols exist for a reason, and you followed them perfectly." Mills nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was far from over. The look in the Russian general's eyes suggested that this was a man who was not accustomed to being challenged, and Mills worried about potential consequences. As General Petrov was led toward a private meeting room inside Windsor Castle, he had no idea that his troubles were just beginning. The incident at the guard post was about to trigger a chain of events that would affect not only his own career, but also diplomatic relations between two major powers. The morning that had started with such promise was turning into a nightmare, and the worst part was that it was all being documented for the world to see. Within 2 hours of the incident, videos of General Petrov's confrontation with the Queen's Guard had gone viral across the internet. The hashtag #Queen'sGuard incident was trending worldwide with millions of views and thousands of comments. News outlets from London to Moscow were running the story as breaking news. In the private meeting room at Windsor Castle, General Petrov sat across from a panel that included Colonel Harrison, Detective Inspector Collins, and a representative from the Foreign Office named James Whitmore. The atmosphere was tense and formal. "General Petrov," Whitmore began carefully, "I'm sure you understand the gravity of this situation. The Queen's Guard are not merely ceremonial soldiers. They are active military personnel protecting one of our most important royal residences." Petrov's face was stone-like, but inside he was churning with anger and regret. His translator Boris sat beside him, looking increasingly nervous as the conversation continued. "What you are calling an attack was simply a request for military courtesy. Petrov replied stiffly. In Russia, soldiers show respect to senior officers regardless of nationality. Inspector Collins leaned forward. Sir, with respect, you physically touched a guard who was on duty. This action triggered our security protocols. The guard responded exactly as he was trained to do. The door opened and another official entered, someone Boris immediately recognized as a senior diplomat from the Russian embassy. Ambassador Nikolai Volkov looked grim as he took a seat next to Petrov. General, Volkov said in Russian, do you have any idea what you have done? The conversation that followed in rapid Russian was heated, but quiet. Boris could hear enough to understand that Petrov was receiving a severe reprimand from his own government. The ambassador's face showed barely controlled fury. Gentlemen, Volkov said, switching back to English, I must apologize on behalf of the Russian Federation for this regrettable incident. General Petrov acted outside of diplomatic protocol, and we take full responsibility. Petrov's jaw dropped. He had expected support from his embassy, not condemnation. Ambassador, surely you understand that I was defending the honor of— You were defending nothing, Volkov snapped in Russian. You have embarrassed our entire country on the international stage. The British officials exchanged glances. They had not expected such a sharp rebuke from Petrov's own people, but it made their position easier. Meanwhile, outside the castle, news crews were arriving from major networks. The story was being reported not just as a diplomatic incident, but as an example of international tensions playing out in an unexpected venue. In Moscow, Petrov's military superiors were watching the viral videos with growing horror. The general had been representing Russia at an official function, and his behavior was being seen as emblematic of Russian military attitudes. Back in the meeting room, Whitmore was outlining the British government's position. Under normal circumstances, an incident like this could result in serious charges. However, given General Petrov's diplomatic status and the ambassador's assurances, we are prepared to handle this as a diplomatic matter. What does that mean exactly? Volkov asked. It means General Petrov's visit to Britain will be terminated immediately. He will be escorted to the airport and expected to leave the country by this evening. Petrov's face went red again. This is outrageous. I am being expelled for asking for a simple salute? Inspector Collins spoke up. Sir, you physically assaulted a member of the British Armed Forces who was performing his duty. In any other context, this would result in arrest and criminal charges. The weight of his actions was finally beginning to sink in for Petrov. He looked at the faces around the table and realized that there would be no diplomatic salvation for his pride. Furthermore, Whitmore continued, this incident will be formally reported to both governments. There will likely be an official protest filed regarding this breach of protocol. Ambassador Volkov nodded grimly. That is understood and expected. General Petrov will face appropriate consequences from our own military hierarchy. As they spoke, Lance Corporal Mills was giving a detailed statement to military investigators. His actions were being thoroughly reviewed, but initial indications suggested he had followed protocol perfectly. The foreign officer became increasingly agitated, Mills reported. When he made physical contact, I responded according to standing orders for the protection of the guard post. Corporal Thompson corroborated every detail of Mills's account. Both guards would later be commended for their professional response under difficult circumstances. The viral videos continued spreading, with news commentators analyzing every frame. Military experts were praising the guards' restraint and professionalism while criticizing Petrov's behavior as completely inappropriate. On Russian social media, reactions were mixed. Some defended Petrov as standing up for national honor, while others were embarrassed by his behavior. The incident was becoming a symbol of broader issues in international relations. By late afternoon, General Petrov was at Heathrow Airport, accompanied by embassy security and British officials. His military career, which had spanned decades and multiple countries, was effectively over. The flight back to Moscow was the longest of Petrov's life. He spent the hours replaying the morning's events, wondering how a simple matter of military courtesy had exploded into an international incident. Boris sat several rows behind him, already drafting his resignation letter. He had no desire to be associated with the fallout that was sure to come. When they landed in Moscow, Petrov was met not by military honors, but by two stern-faced officers from the Defense Ministry. His medals and uniform, which had been sources of such pride that morning, now felt like weights dragging him down. Within a week, Petrov was forced into early retirement. The official statement cited, "conduct unbecoming of an officer and diplomat." His pension was reduced, and he was banned from any future diplomatic or military roles. The guards at Windsor Castle returned to their normal duties, but the incident had made them minor celebrities. Tourists often asked about the Russian general incident, and Lance Corporal Mills found himself unexpectedly famous. "I was just doing my job," Mills told reporters when they tracked him down. "The Queen's Guard has protocols for a reason, and we follow them regardless of who tests them." The incident became a case study in military academies around the world about the importance of protocol and professional conduct. It was used to illustrate how personal pride could override professional judgment with disastrous consequences. For General Viktor Petrov, what should have been a routine diplomatic visit had become the defining moment of his career, and not in the way he had hoped. His demand for a simple salute had cost him everything he had worked for over 4 decades of military service. In his small apartment in Moscow, Petrov would often watch the viral videos of his downfall, wondering how different things might have been if he had simply swallowed his pride and walked away. The Queen's Guard had won their standoff without firing a shot or saying a word beyond their training. The lesson was clear. Sometimes the strongest response is no response at all, and true strength lies in maintaining discipline even when provoked. It was a lesson that General Viktor Petrov had learned far too late, and at far too high a price. The guards at Windsor Castle continued their eternal watch, unmoved by the wind, the weather, or the occasional difficult visitor who tested their resolve. They had proven once again that the traditions they protected were stronger than any individual's pride or anger.